All right, welcome to Word Before Work Summer Series. I'm excited to tell you guys a little bit more about Jesus today, and hopefully you get the chance to watch this and listen to this. We're in John chapter 2. Again, remember there's three events in John chapter 2, the miracle at the wedding feast, the cleansing of the temple, and then the last few verses are about miracles in Jerusalem. We're probably actually going to take 2 weeks to talk about the cleansing of the temple because there's so much going on here. And so I want to set the stage for what's happening and then give you kind of the picture of how it fits in with John the author's purpose. And then next week we'll talk a little bit about the character of Jesus and what that means for us as we look at this story. So if you read the story, this is John chapter 2, verses 13 through 21. And basically the story is that Passover is at hand. It's coming, the Feast of Passover. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and he goes into the temple where they were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and they were exchanging currency. And he brings a whip of cords that he had made, and he drives everybody out. He turns over the tables. He's whipping things, people, animals. I don't know, but he's pretty riled up and pretty zealous. Zealous is the word I would use, and that's the word that the scriptures use here in verse 17. And he drives everybody out, and he says, "Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." So he's defending his Father's honor. He's defending his house. He's defending his honor as God. And then the Jews ask him, "Hey, on what authority do you do these things?" Essentially, and he gives them his answer. And so that's kind of the story here. I'm going to paint the picture for you of kind of like the surrounding context. What made Jesus so upset? What were these people doing wrong that they weren't supposed to be doing? So we'll dive into that real quick. So as I said, this is Passover, and this is a required feast. You're required to travel to Jerusalem for Passover. So there's all kinds of people coming to Jerusalem from the rest of Israel, and they're bringing their animals for sacrifice, their oxen, their sheep, their doves, whatever it was that they could afford or that they had or that they could bring for sacrifice. And the religious leaders who were running the temple, the Sadducees, are basically taking advantage of these travelers for their own personal gain. So these people would show up after traveling for a long time, and they brought the best lamb that they had or the best dove that they had, and the Sadducees would look at it and say, "I'm sorry, but that's not good enough. Oh, but by the way, we have some lambs over here and some sheep over here that for a limited time offer, you can get it for, 20, whatever the price was, but it was marked way up of what it would actually cost." And then in order to buy that animal that they were told that they needed to buy if there was going to be a sacrifice for their family, they had to exchange their currency, and they would get ripped off at the exchangers table as well. The exchangers would take advantage of them and not give them, equal currency exchange. And so there's two things here that I think really brought Jesus to the tipping point of deciding to do something about the situation and to respond as zealously as he did. The first one is simply taking advantage of the weak and the poor and those that, brought the best that they had, but the priests, said that it wasn't good enough. But that's just the first layer. The second layer, and the layer that I think rubbed them the wrong way the most, was that they were using God's system to take advantage of the poor and the weak. In other words, like they're exploiting God's system to take advantage of the poor and the weak, and they're doing it in Jesus' name. They're doing it in God's name. In order to have an acceptable sacrifice, your stuff isn't good enough. Like here's God's system of religion, here's God's sacrificial system, and it's like they sat down and asked the question, now how can we exploit God's system to make a little bit of extra money off of Passover? Passover's coming up. A lot of people are going to be coming into Jerusalem, and they're coming to do something holy and sacred and an act of worship. How can we use that to make ourselves some more money? Is really the question that they were asking. And Jesus hated it. He hated it. And you see that in his response. And so he says, do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Like the purpose of this place is prayer. The purpose of this place is worship. You're turning it, you're saying the biggest the biggest purpose of this place is money. The biggest purpose of this place is personal gain. That's what it's all about. That's what they were turning it into. And so he's defending the honor of God, the Father, and he's defending, as God, he's defending his own temple, the place where, he was supposed to dwell. So that's what brought him, to this tipping point, and that's what caused him to, do the actions that he had done. Now, let's move on. Next week we'll talk about kind of the character of Jesus in that and what it means for us. But let's move on to this next interaction because it's just so cool. So the Jews saw all this stuff happen, and they say in verse 19, "What sign do you show us since you do these things?" And what they're really asking is, okay, we saw you do these things. What are you going to show us so that we know that you actually have the authority to do this stuff? Like, why should we actually listen to you? Like, who are you to come in and do this stuff to the temple? In other words, like, God's the only one that have the authority to do that. What credentials do you have to show us that you're from God? Like, come on, like, pay out, like, give me your driver's license or your passport. Like, show us the credentials that you have, to do this thing. And Jesus' answer to them was the resurrection. Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will bring it back to life again." It's just a boss statement, because the people that were watching this, right, 3 years later, are going to see Jesus Christ rise from the dead. And the Bible specifically says that, the disciples are going to, remember this, and that he did rise from the dead. But basically this is, he's saying, I'm going to prove to you that I'm God when I come back from the dead, after 3 days of, after my crucifixion. And so he wasn't bluffing, right? So, sorry, I'm tripping over my thoughts because I have this written down in a cool way, and I'm trying to say it without looking, but I'm just going to read my notes. So it brings us back to John 20:31, right? "These things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name." Jesus cleansed the temple with the authority as the Son of God to do so. He cleansed the temple under that authority, the Son of God the Father. That's the authority that he used to cleanse the temple. And guess what? As it turned out, he wasn't bluffing, because 3 days after he died, he came back to life and defeated death. So yeah, he has the authority and the power to cleanse the temple. It's just like Jesus is an absolute boss. Like, pardon the slang, but he's an absolute boss, and that's just such a cool move of his. And then finally, I'll close with this. This is also an example of progressive revelation, which basically describes the way that God has revealed himself to us over time. So since the fall of man, God has been progressively revealing himself to us throughout history, and this will culminate with, the second coming of Christ to the earth, setting up the millennial kingdom, and then, eternal glory forever and ever. We had the Old Testament first. We had the Pentateuch, and then the prophets, and the poetry, and then and then we have the New Testament. But here is kind of like a micro version of that. That's all like the macro version. This is like a micro version. Jesus tells them something that he knows they're not going to understand. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it back up again. He knows they're not going to understand that, but he's okay with it because he knows that 3 years later, when he does rise from the dead, those that were paying attention will remember. And I think that two things will essentially happen as a result of that. One, it'll increase their trust in God, right? He knew what he was talking about when he said that. Sorry, I'm tripping over my thoughts again because of what I had written down. Basically, God might do this at times in our own life, right? God will do something that we don't understand. God will say something that we don't understand. God will ask us to do something that we don't understand, or there'll be a problem that we don't understand. And God's okay doing that because he knows the future. He knows that someday we may very well see the resolution of those things. We may very well come to see his hand in that all along. And so it causes us to be patient and to wait on the Lord. And it just gives us an example that, like, it's okay if God tells you something that you don't understand. God's not in a hurry to make sure that you understand everything right now that he's doing in your life. He's perfectly comfortable telling you something that you don't understand and then kind of just making you sit in that and wait in that and, wonder what's happening. Because someday, one day, God will make it all make sense and you'll see, oh, okay, that's what he was doing. The second thing that does, I think, is it increases our faith because we get to look back and see God's intentionality. Right? When the resolution of that thing happens and we go, oh man, no way. Like 4 years ago when I was talking to this person and they said that to me and now it all makes sense because this is what happened today. And it's the same exact thing. 3 years ago, he said, destroy this temple. We were all so confused. We thought he was talking about the temple, but he was talking about his body. He knew, he knows what he's doing. And, I think that just causes us to increase our faith. So it's like a micro progressive revelation. He told them a little bit. He knew he wouldn't understand, but then it would be revealed what he meant, and it would increase their understanding of what God was doing. So I know this video is way longer than I usually upload, but there's a lot in the story I wanted to get to, and I didn't want to divide it up into like 5 weeks, so we'll divide it up into 2 weeks. All right, see you next week.